It started as a day no different from any other in the Willowbend apartments. The kind of aging, four-story complex where carpets hold the memory of decades, and the walls, thin as they are, carry the smallest sounds. For Rachel Marin, a 32-year-old single mother raising her 8-year-old daughter, the building had always been a little too old, a little too creaky, but manageable. The only thing that had begun to bother her in recent weeks were the scratching noises inside the walls, intermittent at first, then persistent enough that they kept her awake. She mentioned them to neighbors in passing, shrugged it off as pests, and did what every tenant here eventually had to do: schedule a routine inspection. She placed the call on a Wednesday afternoon, just after lunch, telling the company's dispatcher that the noises were coming from the bedroom wall and seemed to intensify at night. The earliest available slot was the next day. The technician assigned was someone she'd never met: Eli Turner, a man with a work history that seemed clean and uneventful. The dispatcher confirmed the time, marked her in the schedule, and that was it. Nothing unusual. No warning. Nothing that hinted Rachel would never be seen again. The following day, a little after 2 p.m., Willowbend was going through its ordinary weekday rhythm. The sun was high but fading behind clouds, and most of the complex was quiet. Parents at work, kids still in school, retirees napping behind drawn curtains. At 2:14 p.m., the security camera positioned at the front gate recorded the exterminator's van turning into the lot. Even though the timestamp was hard to read, the vehicle's company logo was unmistakable green lettering against a beige background, the same branding Rachel had been expecting. The van eased into a visitor's parking spot not far from her building's entrance. Residents who happened to glance outside later said the same thing. They remembered hearing heavy footsteps on the stairwell, a drag of equipment wheels, maybe someone walking up to the second floor. No one saw Rachel step outside. No one heard a struggle. No one heard anything alarming at all. It was just an ordinary sound in an ordinary hallway. Rachel's daughter returned home a little after 3:20 p.m., backpack still slung over one shoulder, expecting the normal routine: her mom in the kitchen finishing a late lunch, or folding laundry, or on the couch scrolling through her phone. Instead, she found the apartment door unlocked, not wide open, but unlatched, hanging slightly ajar like someone had stepped out for a moment and forgotten to pull it shut. The lights in the living room were still on. The TV was off. There was no food out, no mess, nothing that suggested an emergency or even a rush. Everything looked still. But something felt wrong immediately, even to a child. She called out for her mother once, then twice. The silence that answered was thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. She walked from room to room until she reached the kitchen counter, where Rachel's phone sat plugged into the charger, its screen still lit with a half-typed text message she'd never finished. At first, her daughter assumed she must have stepped outside to talk to someone, maybe the exterminator, maybe a neighbor. But minutes passed, and unease gave way to fear. She tried calling her mother's phone, even though it was right there in front of her. When the ringtone chimed from the counter, she panicked and raced to a neighbor's door. Within minutes, the building manager was notified. Then security. Then the police. Detectives arrived around 4:10 p.m. and immediately began piecing together the last few hours. The first question was obvious. Where was the exterminator? Why had the van been recorded entering the lot but not leaving until nearly an hour later? And why wasn't there any sign inside the apartment that an inspection had taken place? No equipment, no chemical smell, no notes left behind. When police reached out to the company to verify the appointment, the dispatcher confirmed Rachel had been scheduled for a routine inspection between 2 and 3 p.m. Nothing unusual about the service ticket. Nothing unusual about the technician. Eli Turner, 41, 3 years with the company, no complaints. But when detectives called Eli himself, his story instantly raised every possible red flag. He claimed he never made it to the complex that day. He said his truck had broken down en route, that he spent the entire afternoon trying to jump it, then waiting for a tow. He insisted that he never reached Willowbend, never parked there, never walked into the building, never stepped foot inside any unit, and he certainly never entered apartment 5B. Detectives confronted him with the GPS data that directly contradicted his story. His van had indeed arrived at the complex. It had stayed there for exactly 53 minutes. It had then left without any additional stops before returning to his company's lot. When pushed, Eli doubled down. He didn't know why the GPS registered the wrong location. Maybe the dispatcher made a mistake. Maybe someone else used his truck. He swore he wasn't lying. The more he spoke, the less sense he made. While investigators were talking to him, another team began a careful sweep of Rachel's apartment. They looked for all the things you expect in vanishings: signs of forced entry, overturned furniture, missing belongings, hints of a hurried exit. But everything appeared almost eerily normal. Her purse hung from its usual hook, the wallet still inside with cash and cards untouched. Her keys were on the table. Her shoes were by the door. Her glasses rested on the nightstand. Nothing was packed. Nothing was moved. Nothing suggested she'd walked out on her own. What detectives did find were smaller, quieter details, things that felt like echoes of whatever had happened. On the kitchen counter, the half-typed message Rachel had started earlier that afternoon read, "I keep hearing that sound again," and then it broke off mid-sentence. No punctuation, no correction, no attempt to finish. The draft timestamp placed it minutes before the exterminator's van entered the lot. In her bedroom, the vent cover near the ceiling hung slightly crooked, as though someone had removed it recently or jostled it. There was a faint smudge on the wall beneath it, a handprint, a tool mark, hard to tell in the dim evening light. Forensics photographed everything but found no immediate evidence of force or tampering. The vent screws had not been stripped. The handprint was too faint to lift. Neighbors told investigators they recalled faint creaking and a short, sharp sound around 2:20 or 2:30 p.m., but nothing loud enough to alarm them at the time. One tenant thought she heard two voices, maybe a woman and a man, but admitted she could have been mistaken. Sound traveled strangely through the old building. Another swore she heard something heavy drop, like a box or a toolbox. None of it formed a clear picture. Every detail was small, vague, fragmented. Yet each added weight to the growing sense that something had happened in that narrow window of time, something silent, quick, and deeply wrong. Detectives tried reconstructing Rachel's last hour. She'd been home, texting someone, preparing for the inspection. She likely opened the door expecting the technician she was scheduled to meet. No sign of hesitation. No signs of a struggle. Someone entered. Something happened. Within minutes, she was gone. But without fingerprints, without witnesses, without any physical disturbance inside the apartment, investigators were left floating in uncertainty. The only solid thread was the exterminator's van, a van they knew had been present, but whose driver insisted he wasn't there at all. As officers reviewed more footage, they also noticed something subtle. The van's windows were tinted enough that it was impossible to tell if someone else had been inside with the driver or if someone other than Eli had stepped out during those 53 minutes. As the evening deepened, detectives found themselves returning again and again to one question. If Eli Turner wasn't lying, then who was in his van? And if he was lying, what was he hiding? Standing inside the quiet apartment, with the living room lights still burning and the air growing colder, they couldn't shake the sense that the disappearance had unfolded in complete silence, like Rachel had simply dissolved into the thin, aging walls of the building she'd lived in for years. And as the first night crept in, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to be a simple missing person case. It was something stranger, darker, and far more deliberate than anyone had realized. And the only person who seemed to know anything about those missing 53 minutes was already insisting he'd never been there at all. The more detectives pressed into the hours surrounding Rachel's disappearance, the more every path seemed to lead back to one person, the man who insisted he had never even walked into her building. When detectives brought Eli Turner into the small interview room, he sat with an expression that was neither nervous nor defensive. It was something else entirely. Blank. Sterile, like someone repeating lines they'd practiced alone in a mirror. He folded his hands neatly on the table, answered questions with the same measured tone, and claimed over and over that he never entered apartment 5B, never met Rachel, and never even made it to her floor. According to him, the entire day had been a mistake. He said he'd arrived at the complex, realized he had the wrong building, and left after a few minutes. No inspection, no interaction, nothing unusual. But from the first moments of the interview, small cracks formed in the story. Detectives across the table watched him carefully. His voice never shifted, even when confronted with details that should have earned at least a flicker of surprise. He looked down only when he was unsure, pausing just long enough to seem unnatural. When asked what he was doing during the 53 minutes his van sat in the Willow Bend parking lot, he hesitated before repeating the same line he'd said earlier. Truck issues, confusion, maybe he made a wrong turn. The details didn't change, but there was something off in the way he delivered them, something unconvincing and strangely rehearsed. What troubled detectives more was what they'd noticed earlier that afternoon, small details that contradicted everything Eli insisted was true. His uniform shirt, though seemingly clean, carried faint dust caught in the fabric around the sleeves and collar. When brushed lightly, it released a powdery residue consistent with old insulation material, the kind you find in aging buildings like Willow Bend, where the walls have been patched and repatched for decades. There was nothing in his assigned jobs that day involving attic work, ceiling access, or wall openings. The dust shouldn't have been there at all. Then there was his work tablet, which technicians had pulled for review. The device time-stamped each job automatically. While Eli claimed he never entered Rachel's unit, the system recorded an inspection start at 2:19 p.m., and the geotag placed him precisely at her front door. He refused to acknowledge the log, said it must have glitched, said maybe another technician had logged in with his credentials. But the tablet, like the GPS on the van, didn't lie. The entries were clean, without corruption, without any indicators of error. Detectives felt the room grow heavier with each contradiction. The more they presented, the more Eli retreated into that hollow calmness, repeating that he couldn't recall the details of the day very well, as if a routine Thursday afternoon had dissolved from his memory entirely. While investigators spoke with him, another team canvassed the complex to verify what neighbors had heard. And the building manager, a man who'd worked there long enough to recognize every usual sound the structure made, offered a detail that complicated the interview even further. He said he'd been sorting maintenance logs in his office around the same time the exterminator's van was logged on camera. He remembered footsteps, heavy boots going up the stairs toward Rachel's floor. He said the footsteps had a steady rhythm, a pacing pattern, as if someone was walking back and forth in front of her door or inside her unit. He estimated the pacing lasted close to half an hour, long enough that he almost poked his head out to see what was going on. But by the time he'd reached the stairwell, the hallway was silent. When detectives relayed this information to Eli, he showed no reaction, no recognition, no denial with emotion behind it. Just the same flat insistence that he had never gone upstairs and that he had no idea what the manager could have heard. His answers began circling themselves, turning thinner and less grounded with every loop. Something was wrong, whether with his story, his memory, or his involvement, detectives couldn't yet determine. But the difference between his tone and the evidence was widening like a widening fault line. Back inside Rachel's apartment, forensic teams were moving slowly, documenting anything that might hint at what happened during those lost minutes. The apartment still appeared largely undisturbed, but the longer they studied it, the more subtle anomalies began to reveal themselves. The dining chair closest to the hallway wasn't pushed in like the others. It sat angled outward, facing the entrance, as if someone had pulled it back slightly or turned toward the door in surprise. Rachel's slippers, normally kept beside her bed, lay unevenly on the living room floor, one near the couch, one turned on its side a few feet away. It looked like someone had stepped out of them abruptly, not violently, but suddenly, with no intention to place them neatly. Then there was the faint smear discovered on the inside of the doorframe, a thin, nearly invisible streak of pesticide residue at knee level. Detectives found it only when the ultraviolet beam caught the faint chemical sheen. It wasn't enough to indicate a struggle, but it was enough to prove that someone carrying pesticide had made contact with the door that afternoon. And since Rachel had no reason to handle those chemicals herself, the trace pointed back directly to the one person who claimed he never stepped inside. As these details accumulated, residents began sharing something else details from the days leading up to the disappearance that were unsettling but easy to overlook on their own. Several tenants on the second floor reported hearing tapping inside the walls earlier that week. Some thought it was rodents. Others assumed it was pipes or the building settling. A few mentioned lights flickering at odd hours, especially in the hallway outside Rachel's unit. One tenant recalled a smell of damp wood, almost rotting, drifting through the hall near her door for several nights. She said it was especially strong on the evening before Rachel disappeared. Maintenance had been called, but the alert never reached anyone who acted on it. Detectives started mapping the building's structural layout to understand where the noises, smells, and flickering might have originated. Willow Bend was old, and in the decades since its construction, the building had undergone multiple partial renovations without ever being fully modernized. That meant layers of hidden spaces, crawl spaces above hallways, narrow utility closets connecting different wings, access panels wedged behind appliances, and even a maintenance tunnel system that predated current fire codes. These tunnels had been sealed decades ago, the entrances boarded or locked, but maintenance records showed some of the panels had shifted over time as the building settled. The more investigators studied the layout, the clearer it became that there were spaces inside Willow Bend few tenants knew existed. Dark corners between units, voids behind walls, paths once used by electricians and repair crews, and now forgotten. The building was a maze of old architecture, places someone could slip into, intentionally or unintentionally, with no one noticing. A place where sounds could travel unpredictably. A place where someone could hide. A place where someone could move unseen. As detectives layered this information onto the timeline of Rachel's disappearance, the tension surrounding Eli's denial grew thick and unavoidable. Everything pointed toward his presence, his van, his tablet, his uniform, the chemical smudge on her door, the sound of boots pacing upstairs. And yet his demeanor never changed, never cracked. Each time he was asked whether he remembered entering the building, he repeated the same phrase. He couldn't recall the details very well. He didn't know why the logs were wrong. He didn't know why the uniform was dirty. He didn't know what the building manager heard. His answers were eerily calm, too calm. Detectives weren't sure if he was lying, protecting someone, or genuinely unable to remember. And that uncertainty became its own unsettling presence. Because whether Eli was involved or not, something strange was happening inside Willow Bend, something the tenants had sensed without realizing it, something that had moved through the walls before Rachel disappeared. By the end of the day, investigators had more evidence than explanations. The building itself had become a suspect, its corners, its hidden spaces, its aging infrastructure holding secrets no one had bothered to notice before. And as they left the apartment that night, locking the door behind them, they couldn't escape the feeling that Rachel hadn't simply vanished into thin air. She had disappeared into something that had been building for days, something connected to the noises in the walls, the flickering lights, the damp smell, and the technician who claimed he remembered nothing at all. And whatever waited inside those forgotten spaces between the walls was about to become the center of the investigation. The weeks following Rachel's disappearance forced detectives into a rhythm that felt heavier with every passing day. What started as a straightforward missing person case quickly evolved into something that resisted structure, resisted logic, resisted every attempt to understand it. The building itself seemed to absorb the investigation, pulling every clue into a maze of decaying infrastructure and dead-end theories. As the days bled into weeks, and the weeks into months, the case took on a kind of quiet strangeness that no one could comfortably explain. Not law enforcement, not the residents, not even the investigators who had seen their share of complicated disappearances. They began by looking deeper into Eli Turner's past, hoping something there might clarify the contradictions in his story. Former co-workers from the pest control company described him with near unanimity. Quiet, compliant, the kind of employee who did what he was told without ever being confrontational. They said he kept to himself, rarely spoke beyond what was necessary, and seemed almost uncomfortable when attention was placed on him. Several recalled his uneasiness with tight spaces, crawl spaces, and attic inspections were assignments he avoided whenever possible. One coworker mentioned that Eli once refused to enter a narrow crawl tunnel on a job, saying he felt like the walls were breathing. But none of them could remember a single moment where he seemed aggressive, threatening, or capable of harming anyone. That portrait only deepened the mystery. Nothing about the man matched the idea of someone who would abduct a woman in broad daylight. Yet the evidence, irregular as it was, continued pointing toward him. Detectives leaned into that contradiction as they searched for a way forward. In the second month of the investigation, search teams introduced cadaver dogs to the Willowbend complex. If Rachel had been harmed anywhere within or around the property, the dogs might pick up a trace. They moved slowly through the hallways, the laundry room, the basement storage areas, and even the courtyard. Residents gathered behind the taped-off areas, watching quietly. People wanted closure, even if they feared the form it might take. When the dogs alerted near an old storage hallway behind the laundry room, the response was immediate. Forensic teams descended on the spot, peeling back layers of dust and debris that had settled over years. The hallway was narrow, lined with old paint cans, unused mops, and forgotten boxes from tenants who had moved away long before Rachel ever lived there. But after hours of searching, nothing surfaced. No remains, no blood, no hair, no objects belonging to Rachel. The dogs had reacted strongly, but whatever triggered them left no trace behind. Detectives refused to dismiss the alert, so they ordered a deeper forensic sweep. Technicians discovered faint clothing fibers caught on rusty nails inside a maintenance hatch that lined the hallway. The hatch had not been opened in years. The dust patterns alone confirmed that. But the fibers didn't match anything in Rachel's wardrobe. They belonged to someone else, someone whose identity remained unknown. The find, rather than clarifying the situation, introduced another layer of confusion. Someone had been inside spaces no one had reason to enter. Someone had brushed past nails in a hatch that should have been sealed by time. As investigators continued to run into conflicting evidence and non-answers, media interest began to grow. The case transitioned from a local disappearance to a regional oddity. Journalists began speculating about what might have happened within the aging walls of Willowbend. With the attention came rumors spreading among tenants, each stranger than the last. Over several weeks, multiple residents reported hearing footsteps beneath their floors at night, deliberate and rhythmic. Others spoke about doorknobs rattling as if someone tested them quietly in the dark. One claimed to have seen a shadowy figure behind the dumpsters in the weeks before Rachel vanished. A man who didn't live in the building but passed through the lot as if mapping out the area. Detectives dismissed some of these accounts as the result of fear and suggestion, anxiety feeding imagination, but they couldn't ignore how many people described similar sounds. It was as if the building had started whispering its own version of events, but none of those whispers were clear enough to map into solid evidence. Determined not to lose momentum, investigators revisited Eli's movements that day. His GPS trail, already suspicious, gained new complexity after they pulled footage from a gas station 2 blocks from Willowbend. The camera captured his van passing by shortly after 1:50 p.m., then again roughly 8 minutes later. He was circling the area. Investigators traced the timing. He drove past Willowbend once, then again, before finally pulling into the lot at 2:14 p.m., the exact time the security cameras recorded his entry. The circling behavior made no sense if he was simply heading to an appointment. It suggested hesitation. It suggested uncertainty. But it also raised the question investigators hated most: was Eli unsure? Or was he watching something? When confronted with the footage during a second interview, Eli showed no anger, no fear, no defensive posture. Instead, he leaned into confusion, saying he didn't remember why he circled, didn't remember stopping at the gas station, didn't remember anything between picking up supplies that morning and arriving home later that evening. The missing 22 minutes in his timeline remained unaccounted for, and no amount of pressure seemed to shake loose a single detail. Detectives began to wonder if they were dealing with something more layered, whether Eli had memory gaps, whether he was protecting himself or someone else, or whether his mind had simply fractured under stress. Yet regardless of his internal state, the evidence kept circling him like a shadow he couldn't escape. And the more his story wavered, the more the building's strange behaviors seemed connected to him, even if investigators couldn't understand the connection. Meanwhile, Rachel's family refused to let the case drift into silence. Her sister organized weekly searches through nearby wooded areas, even though police insisted the likelihood of her being outside the building was low. Volunteers from surrounding neighborhoods joined in, expanding the search radius month after month. Her mother held candlelight vigils outside the Willowbend entrance, her voice trembling as she thanked each person who showed up. Flyers appeared on telephone poles, on bus stops, inside grocery stores. Fundraisers were held to support extended search efforts, and for a while the community's determination provided momentum that law enforcement alone couldn't sustain. But time wore down even the strongest spirits. After the sixth month, fewer volunteers came. Flyers faded in the Sunday, the fundraisers slowed. Investigators rotated through the case until it felt less like they were searching for a person and more like they were observing a void where someone used to be. A full year passed without a single new lead surfacing. The walls inside Willowbend stopped making noise, or perhaps residents stopped listening. The apartment Rachel left behind became a sealed moment, untouched since the day officers first responded. Her sister kept the lease active just in case investigators ever needed to return, but the unit stayed locked. Inside, nothing had moved. The drying laundry still folded in the basket, the framed photos on the shelves, the small plant on the windowsill struggling with the limited light. When detectives entered occasionally to reassess a detail or revisit the scene, the stillness inside felt almost oppressive. The air carried the same quietness that surrounded her disappearance, an unfinished sentence suspended in time. After 12 months with no progress, the case grew heavy, even for seasoned investigators. They reviewed every report, every tip, every dead end. They looked again at the building's structural layout, trying to piece together whether someone could have used the hidden spaces to move unseen. The maintenance hatches, the sealed tunnels, the forgotten crawl spaces, they all hinted at something, but none offered answers. And with no body, no conclusive evidence, and no confession, the case resisted closure at every turn. Detectives found themselves caught between three possibilities, none of which brought comfort. Either they had missed a predator hiding in plain sight, someone who used the building's vulnerabilities to orchestrate a disappearance, or someone within the complex had been involved in a cover-up too intricate to detect. Or the truth was buried deeper within the structure itself, lost in spaces no one had walked through in decades. The investigation settled into a state of exhaustion, suspended between theories. Willowbend remained the same aging complex it had always been, but for those who had worked the case, the building now carried a sense of something hidden behind its everyday facade, something that had been there long before Rachel vanished, something that might still be there. And as the second year approached, detectives began to worry they might never know what really happened inside those walls until one discovery would force the entire case open again. 5 years pass, and the building that once held the weight of Rachel's disappearance tries to bury its history beneath new plaster, fresh carpeting, and a handful of cosmetic upgrades no one asked for. Willowbend's aging structure groans under the construction, as if the building itself knows that patching its surface won't erase the memories sealed in its walls. The landlord, who spent years avoiding questions and keeping Rachel's former unit locked, finally decides to lease it again. There are no official disclosures about its past, no warnings, not even a passing mention of the woman who walked into that apartment and was never seen again. To most of the new residents, Unit 3B is simply another refurbished space in an old, renovated complex. Mason Clark, a quiet 29-year-old freelance photographer, moves in during the early autumn. He arrives with second-hand furniture, a couple of hard drives filled with half-finished projects, and an optimism he hasn't felt in years. The rent is cheap, almost suspiciously so, but the natural light pouring through the windows gives him the impression that he might finally be able to restart his life here. He tells himself he doesn't care why the previous tenant left. People move all the time. People disappear from leases, not always from life. But Willowbend has a habit of revealing its secrets slowly. During his first week, he begins to notice small details that tug at his attention. The bedroom floorboards, for instance. When he sets down a crate of gear, one corner of the floor gives a hollow, almost metallic echo. He tests it again the next morning, tapping the same spot with his heel. The sound rings just slightly off, as though something beneath the wood isn't solid, like there's an empty space under that one small section of the room. He chalks it up to aging construction and tells himself he'll mention it to the landlord later. A couple of nights pass uneventfully, and then the tapping begins. At first, he thinks it's the radiator expanding with heat, but radiators don't tap in patterns. They don't stutter, pause, continue, and faintly change location, as if whatever is causing the noise is moving. The sound comes late at night, sometime between midnight and 3 in the morning, soft and rhythmic, like fingertips brushing against the inside of the wall. He presses his palm to the plaster just to reassure himself there's nothing there, but the vibration is unmistakable. Something shifts behind it, subtle but deliberate. He tries to ignore it, but curiosity never stays quiet for long. One afternoon, while testing a new lens for a client project, he sets up his equipment across the living room floor. As he adjusts the aperture ring, the loose lens cap slips from his fingers. He watches it roll in a clean arc across the wooden boards, heading toward the wall as though pulled by gravity or some invisible slope. It reaches the baseboard beside the radiator and disappears into a thin gap so narrow he hadn't even noticed it existed. He crouches down, expecting to simply retrieve the cap, but when he runs his fingers along the baseboard, he realizes it's not sealed to the wall at all. It shifts under pressure, loose in a way that seems intentional. With a slow tug, the entire board comes free, revealing a dark, vertical opening. It smells of dust and something old, something unused but not quite undisturbed. Behind it is a crawl space. He shines a small flashlight inside, expecting insulation or pipes. Instead, he finds a narrow corridor, barely wide enough for someone to move through. Dust blankets the beams and floor, thick enough to blur the edges of everything it touches. But one thing stands out, a thin, meandering trail where the dust has been pushed aside. A path. Not recent, but not quite ancient either. A single line that winds deeper into the narrow passage as though someone once crawled through it many times, brushing against the floor, leaving faint impressions behind. The discovery leaves him unsettled. Buildings this old often have strange structural quirks, but he has lived in enough apartments to know the difference between forgotten architecture and a crawl space someone actually used. Later that evening, he mentions the hollow boards and the crawl space to a neighbor he runs into near the mailboxes. The man freezes for a moment before giving a tight, uncomfortable smile. He doesn't ask questions, doesn't seem curious. Instead, he mutters something about the building being old, then walks away faster than before. Mason notices the way the man refuses to make eye contact afterward, as though even acknowledging the unit invites misfortune. He tries asking another resident the next day, an elderly woman who often sits on the bench near the courtyard. She gives him a nervous glance when he mentions his unit, then quietly tells him there was once a young woman who lived there. She was kind, polite, always waved at neighbors in the mornings. And then, one afternoon, she vanished. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, no note. She simply disappeared inside the walls of Willowbend. The case was never solved. The building still whispers about it. Mason feels the information settle into him like a weight. Suddenly the hollow floors, the tapping, the crawl space, none of it feels random anymore. He doesn't want to believe in coincidences, but he doesn't want to believe in the alternative either. That night, the tapping returns. This time, it's louder. Closer, not a polite knock or a distant echo, but a distinct sound of something shifting wood, lightly brushing wood, dust being disturbed. He turns off the lights and listens, holding his breath as the noise travels down the wall toward the radiator. It pauses, as though sensing him listening, then resumes with a slow drag. Sleep becomes impossible. Over the next few days, he tries to distract himself with work, but the apartment feels different now, charged, watchful. He finds himself checking the baseboard repeatedly, as though expecting something to crawl out of the narrow gap. Every time he looks inside the crawl space, the path seems just slightly clearer, as though dust has shifted. Late one evening, a soft shuffle echoes behind the bedroom wall. It lasts only a second, but it's enough to make him sit up straight in bed. The noise comes again, faint, like someone or something moving past the interior beams. The same path that ran behind the baseboard opening. He tells himself it has to be an animal, a raccoon, a stray cat. But animals don't make consistent, patterned movements over multiple nights. They don't avoid certain sections of the wall and favor others. They don't linger behind a single room. He begins researching the building late into the night, scrolling through old articles, archived news clippings, and forum posts from former residents. Most of it reads like urban legend, rumors of strange sounds, shadows seen under doorframes, maintenance tunnels sealed decades earlier after an accident no one wants to describe. And then he finds her name, Rachel Hayes, missing, never recovered, presumed dead. Last seen in Unit 3B. He closes his laptop and sits in silence, while the tapping resumes on the other side of the wall. The thought that begins to grow inside him is one he doesn't want to entertain, but once formed, it refuses to disappear. If the previous tenant vanished inside this unit, inside these very walls, what if the answers are still in there? What if Willowbend never stopped hiding her? The crawl space becomes impossible to ignore. Every day, it waits in the corner of his living room, a narrow opening into the building's forgotten anatomy. Each time he walks past it, he feels a pull fear mixed with fascination. His mind drifts back to the path in the dust, that single trail showing movement years after the building supposedly sealed its maintenance routes. On a cold, quiet afternoon, he retrieves a flashlight, ties a bandana over his mouth, and kneels beside the open baseboard. Dust hangs in the air, thick and stagnant. The crawl space stretches ahead like a vein carved deep into the building's body. He hesitates, feeling the air from within the walls brush cool against his face. Something about the temperature doesn't make sense colder than any interior space should be, as if the building is breathing. He takes a slow breath, steadying the trembling in his hands. Every instinct tells him to walk away, to close the baseboard, to pretend he never noticed the tapping or the hollow floor or the trail in the dust. But he can't shake the image of Rachel's name buried in old case files, or the silence surrounding her disappearance, the silence that this building has maintained for 5 long years. With a mixture of dread and resolve, Mason eases himself forward, letting his body slip into the narrow corridor. His shoulders brush against the walls. The darkness ahead swallows the weak beam of the flashlight far too quickly. He doesn't know what he expects to find inside the walls of Willowbend. He only knows he isn't the first person to crawl into this space, and he might not be alone in it now. Mason waits for the moment the building grows quiet. It happens around 2 in the morning, when the last footsteps fade from the hallways and Willowbend sinks back into the strange, heavy silence it seems to prefer. The tapping hasn't stopped, if anything. The last few nights have been worse. The sounds have grown sharper, more deliberate, as though whatever is inside the walls has become aware that someone else is listening. He can't pretend anymore. He can't rationalize the noises or dismiss the hollow floor or ignore the path carved through the dust behind the baseboard. The building has been trying to hide something for years, and he knows now that he's already too deep into it to turn away. With a trembling breath, he picks up his flashlight and camera. The crawl space yawns open beside him like a mouth carved into the structure. The air filtering out from inside feels colder than the apartment behind him, carrying a stagnant smell that hasn't moved freely in decades. He lowers himself onto his stomach and pushes forward, letting the darkness swallow him one slow inch at a time. The crawl space forces him to move on elbows and knees, the beams scraping against his clothes and skin. The dust is thick enough to coat his tongue despite the bandana tied around his face. Ahead, the narrow walls pulse with the muted sounds of the building pipes groaning, wood shifting under the weight of lives continuing above him. But the farther he moves, the more those everyday noises fade, replaced by something else. A faint echo, a hollow stillness that tells him he is entering a part of Willowbend no one has stepped into in years. The crawl space opens gradually, widening into what appears to be a forgotten maintenance corridor. Mason pauses, shining his flashlight across the walls. They're covered in cracked paint and old inspection markings faded beyond recognition. Small pipes run along the ceiling, many of them disconnected or sealed with rust. The air feels colder here, as though the temperature drops with each step he takes. He realizes he is standing in the type of hidden passage detectives once theorized, but were never able to locate. A sealed-off artery of the building, one that should not exist, but clearly does. As he moves deeper, the beam of his flashlight catches something lying against the wall ahead, a small blanket, flattened by time and dust. The fabric is worn thin, stained in places, but there's no mistaking the human imprint of someone once folding it for comfort. Beside it sits an old flashlight cracked down its length, its battery compartment rusted shut. A metal thermos leans against the wall, the lid missing, the inside blackened by mold. Nearby, a single torn work glove lies stiff with age, its fingertips frayed as though worn by someone who worked with tools or chemicals. Mason's pulse quickens. These aren't random scraps from a forgotten renovation. Someone lived here, or hid here. maybe for hours, maybe for days. He raises the camera with shaking hands and snaps a few pictures, not out of professionalism, but because some part of him knows he might need proof if he makes it back out. He tries to swallow the rising fear, focusing instead on the objects themselves. Who would have stayed in a place like this, and why? A faint glint catches his eye near the base of a support beam. He kneels, sweeping away a thin layer of dust. Something small is wedged beneath the wood. He reaches for it carefully, pulling out a tiny cloth pouch hardened by time and grime. The drawstring crumbles in his fingers, allowing the items inside to spill softly onto the floor. A cracked phone with a shattered screen, a child's hair clip in faded pink, and an ID card. His hands freeze. The photo is worn. The lamination is peeling at the corners, but the name printed beside the picture is unmistakable. Rachel Marin. The world seems to tilt around him. He stares at the ID card, unable to blink, unable to breathe. This shouldn't be here. None of it should be here. He grips the flashlight tighter, its plastic casing slick against his trembling palms. He doesn't know how long he sits there, kneeling on the cold ground, trying to make sense of what he's found. But one thought finally cuts through the fog. He has to get out. He has to call someone. He backs out of the corridor faster than he entered, scraping elbows against the beams, pushing past the dust and narrowing passage until he spills back into his apartment's living room. He doesn't bother brushing the dust from his clothes. He doesn't try to calm himself. He grabs his phone and dials emergency services with hands that won't stop shaking. When detectives arrive, they move through the apartment quietly, as though afraid to disturb something alive. They listen carefully to Mason, their expressions shifting from disbelief to alarm as he describes what he saw. Soon after, forensic teams arrive with equipment, prepared to enter the crawlspace that had eluded investigators 5 years earlier. Inside, they uncover far more than Mason was able to see in the narrow beam of his flashlight. Handprints on dusty beams, some smeared, some clear, forming patterns of someone repeatedly using the corridor for movement. An access panel nearly invisible from the main crawl space, but unmistakably leading into a narrow route that runs directly beneath the floorboards of Mason's living room. A trail of insulation disturbed in a long, uneven line, stretching back toward the portion of the building closest to the stairwell. A path that looks hauntingly like something heavy, something human had been dragged years ago. As they dust the support beams and the access panel edges, the truth begins to surface. Partial fingerprints emerge. The same pattern, the same ridges, the same minute details the original case files recorded from Rachel's doorframe 5 years earlier. The prints belong to Eli Turner. Detectives gather around the evidence with a mix of triumph and dread. The initial case had left them with fragments: Eli's mismatched alibi, his faint insulation dust, the partial print he had no explanation for. All of it had pointed to him, yet none of it was enough to substantiate a charge. But this crawlspace changes everything. The corridor isn't simply a forgotten part of the building. It's a concealed pathway that only someone with intimate maintenance knowledge could navigate. A hidden artery designed decades ago and never disclosed to tenants, only to those responsible for structural upkeep. And Eli Turner had been an exterminator, trained to access tight spaces, familiar with insulation, ducts, and maintenance routes. He would have known exactly how to use a space like this, how to move through the walls unnoticed, how to slip into an apartment without ever using the front door. The discovery shakes the investigative team. It reshapes the entire theory of the case. If Eli used the crawlspace that day, and the fingerprints suggest that he did, then he wasn't simply mistaken about the address or confused by the layout. He was moving with purpose. And Rachel's disappearance wasn't random. Yet the presence of the child's hair clip and the cracked phone complicate everything further. They don't belong to Rachel. They belong to someone else. Someone the police never knew to look for. Someone whose existence wasn't documented in the original investigation. The crawlspace suggests this hidden corridor might have been used long before Rachel vanished. Used by someone familiar with its twists, its blind corners, its structure, used for something the building's blueprints never intended. Detectives move slowly, photographing, cataloging, working through the confined space with caution. Their voices remain low, as though raised sounds might disturb whatever secrets remain buried in the dust. When they finally emerge, Their faces reveal a mixture of exhaustion and grim determination. The cold case is officially reopened. For the first time since Rachel walked into that apartment and disappeared, investigators believe they finally have a real lead: physical evidence, fingerprints, objects belonging to the missing, a trail not completely erased by time. Mason stands in the doorway, watching as the forensic team seals containers, labels, bags, and prepares evidence to be transported. His apartment feels smaller now, the shadows heavier. He realizes that by entering the crawlspace, he stepped into a part of the building that was never meant to be exposed. And whatever was hidden inside those walls for decades has finally been dragged into the light. As the detectives prepare to leave, one of them pauses inside the living room, looking at the open baseboard, the narrow opening into the crawlspace. She stares at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally speaks, her voice is low, almost resigned. Whoever used that space didn't stop with Rachel. The words linger long after the door closes, settling into the silence of the apartment. The building feels different now, charged, waiting, as if Mason's discovery shook something awake inside it. Something the investigation is only beginning to uncover. The days following the rediscovery of the hidden crawlspace reshaped the entire investigation. Detectives returned to Willowbend with renewed urgency, carrying old files, digital blueprints, and forensic kits that didn't exist 5 years earlier. They move carefully through the apartment and the passage beneath it, mapping every detail and comparing it against the original search logs. What they find begins to stitch together the pieces of a story that had once seemed impossible. With the new physical evidence, the team finally reconstructs the timeline from the afternoon Rachel was last seen, and for the first time, the events form a coherent, harrowing pattern. They determine Rachel almost certainly allowed Eli inside. She had scheduled the appointment, she was home alone, and nothing in the apartment suggests forced entry or a struggle at the door. The faint dust found on Eli's uniform years earlier, once dismissed as trivial, now matches the insulation that lines the hidden corridor Mason uncovered. Investigators traced the thin, uneven smear of pesticide residue found at knee level on Rachel's doorframe during the initial scene processing. Back then, it was an oddity with no meaning. Now, it corresponds to the exact height where Eli would have brushed against the frame while carrying equipment on his hip, moments before stepping inside. What happens next is reconstructed only through fragments, dust patterns, biological traces, fingerprints, and the newly discovered collapse deep inside the wall. But even in pieces, the picture becomes disturbingly clear. Rachel likely watched Eli begin the inspection normally. They estimate he entered around 2:16 p.m., matching the synchronized timestamps from her phone's half-written text and the company's tablet log showing inspection start at her door. Detectives believe something changed shortly after. The renovated building manager's old testimony mentioning heavy boots pacing overhead takes on new meaning. They now suspect Eli wasn't pacing across the hallway but moving within the walls, using knowledge of the building's maintenance structure to access the crawlspace from inside Rachel's apartment. The forensics team studies the dust collected years ago from the baseboard area. Modern analysis reveals traces of a sedative compound mixed within the particulate matter, an anesthetic common in certain pest control fumigants Eli had access to. They theorized that Rachel, realizing Eli had found or was attempting to access a hidden opening in her home, confronted him. That moment, investigators believe, triggered a panicked reaction. Eli either subdued her intentionally or accidentally exposed her to the sedative mixture while trying to regain control of the situation. The position of the overturned slippers, angled as if stepped out of abruptly, and the dining chair slightly turned toward the hallway, reinforced the likelihood that the confrontation was sudden, unexpected. Rachel wasn't prepared. She didn't run. Something disoriented her almost immediately. Within minutes, she lost consciousness. Evidence inside the corridor suggests Eli dragged her through the narrow opening. The long trail of compressed insulation and disturbed dust lines up perfectly with the panel Mason uncovered, one investigators never knew was there. The prints found on the support beams, coated in layers of time but still intact beneath the dust, match Eli's hand structure and ridge pattern. They paint the image of a man moving quickly and roughly through the dark space, guiding or pulling something heavy behind him. But there is another detail, one that had gone unnoticed during the initial investigation. 5 years earlier, the team had dismissed a small, partially collapsed section of wall in a different maintenance tunnel as structural decay. Now, with fresh eyes and new context, they realized the collapse wasn't natural. It was the result of a struggle. Forensic reconstruction reveals the fracture in the beam likely occurred when the weight of two bodies shifted abruptly in the narrow space. Rachel's biological traces, minute bone dust, microscopic tissue fibers, and a faint pattern of blood proteins are discovered near the fracture. The evidence is undeniable. She regained partial consciousness at some point inside the corridor. Whether she fought back or simply fell, investigators conclude Rachel suffered blunt trauma from the collapse, a fatal injury delivered unintentionally but irrevocably. The tunnel beyond that point had been blocked ever since, trapping her body in a portion of the structure even deeper inside the wall system. The detectives understand now why cadaver dogs alerted in unrelated hallways, why the scent was faint, inconsistent, impossible to pinpoint. The remains were sealed behind dense insulation and structural barriers that masked all signals. The next discovery is even more unsettling. During their extended search of the sealed corridors, investigators find a rusted metal box hidden behind a stack of old maintenance panels. Inside it are papers weathered, stained, but still legible. Notes written in Eli Turner's handwriting. They document measurements, angles, entry points, and diagrams of forgotten maintenance tunnels not only in Willowbend, but in two other buildings managed by the same older property company. Pages list resident names, unit numbers, and notations such as Home Alone 2, Late Shift, and Kid Stays at Grandmother's Wednesdays. He had been mapping the buildings for years, not as part of his job, but in secret. The forensic analysts pore over the notes, matching dates to maintenance logs, confirming Eli had repeatedly visited units he was never assigned to. They find proof he accessed crawl spaces that no resident knew existed. He had built an internal map, a silent network enabling him to move unseen through walls, ceilings, and utility spaces, entering and exiting units without detection. The old torn glove Mason found matches a pair logged on Eli's work record years earlier. The cracked flashlight matches a model issued by the company before they upgraded their equipment, and the pouch containing the cracked phone and child's hair clip confirms what investigators had begun to suspect. Rachel wasn't the first person to encounter Eli inside the walls. She was simply the first to disappear. The realization settles heavily onto the investigative team. They comb through the notes again, looking for any sign that Eli might have harmed others. They find no direct proof, but several entries correspond with reports from residents who once complained of missing items, strange noises, or unexplained shadows in their apartments. Things dismissed at the time as paranoia or faulty wiring now have a chilling explanation. Eli's sudden death 2 years after Rachel vanished adds a final cruel twist. It came in the form of a car accident on a rural road, attributed to icy pavement and poor visibility. There had been no reason then to suspect anything deeper. No autopsies revealing dark secrets. No last confession. Just a quiet life ending quietly, leaving the truth entombed behind the drywall of Willowbend. As detectives lay out the entire timeline on the conference table, photos from the crawl space, fingerprints, biological evidence, handwritten maps, and the recovered items belonging to Rachel, the case finally solidifies. All the unanswered questions converge into a single, terrible narrative. Rachel never left the building. She never walked outside, never reached the parking lot, never made it past the walls that surrounded her every day. She died inside the structure, not by the hands of a stranger entering from the outside, but from a man already inside it, someone who used Willowbend not as a workplace, but as a labyrinth. A place where he memorized the forgotten paths and dark passages, slipping through its bones like a shadow beneath the floors of people who trusted their homes to be safe. When detectives deliver the news to Rachel's family, the moment is devastating. Her daughter, now older, listens in a kind of stunned stillness, absorbing the truth that had been hidden from her childhood. Her relatives, who had clung to the hope she might have run away or been taken elsewhere, crumble at the confirmation that Rachel died just feet from where she had last been seen. The knowledge brings closure, but it arrives with a weight that is almost unbearable. And yet, In the quiet grief that follows, one fact becomes impossible to ignore. Mason's accidental discovery ended a mystery that had consumed a community for half a decade. It forced the truth out of the walls, truth that had been buried by insulation, sealed by structural collapse, and silenced by the death of the very man who caused it. The final report states it plainly, leaving no room for ambiguity. Rachel's disappearance was not a vanishing act. She was never abducted by an outsider, never taken far from home, never lost in the world beyond Willowbend. She remained inside the building the entire time, hidden within the structure itself. It is a conclusion that chills everyone who hears it. A reminder that danger sometimes lives quietly behind the drywall, in the places people never think to look. A reminder that the walls that shield lives in families can also hide secrets, and that sometimes the predator is not outside trying to get in, but already there, moving through the passages no one remembers exist. The case closes, but Willowbend is never the same. For those who lived through the years of rumors, the odd noises, the flickering lights, and the unexplained footsteps, the truth becomes a permanent scar. And for the family that waited 5 years for answers, the building transforms into something far more painful, the place that held Rachel in silence long after her voice was gone.